All right, it is my very great pleasure to introduce one of my many co-collaborators, Anastasia Mann. I didn't think of an introduction for you, so I hope you'll introduce yourself. Thank you so much. We work together on the Civil Rights Commission and many other endeavors.
I am Anastasia Mann, or Stacy, and I'm so grateful to Kim for pulling this together, as I know you all are. She just so we couldn't be more grateful to have this library as our resource right here. I am the director of a brand new endeavor at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, which is called SPIA in New Jersey. And the goal of SPIA in New Jersey is to be the policy shop on campus for the locality, the region, the state, and for the school to really step up and bring our resources, which are mainly our people, but also our funds that bought you lunch, to address really pressing problems of facing the public. And so this is an amazing first sort of endeavor of SPIA in New Jersey. I should say that Matt Malesko was one of the driving forces behind the creation of SPIA in New Jersey. So props once again to Matt. And also to Sherrod Smith, who's not with us today, but is a SPIA graduate who is on the Civil Rights Commission in town and has committed himself to, he's at the State Attorney General's office now, so that's a good thing. So really glad to be here with you all, hoping to meet more of you, interact, and that you'll turn to us at SPIA in New Jersey with your policy ideas, and that we can be in community more and more going forward. Really excited about this panel, which Matt will now introduce and moderate. Thanks, everybody.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to see a full room here.
Is your mic on?
Better?
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for being here. Good afternoon. I'm Matt Malesko. I'm a doctoral student at the University of the Street, and I'm joined with a great panel, and we're going to dig into some policies to the problems that we discussed in the first panel earlier today. And I'll introduce them briefly and then turn it over to them to say a few words about their organizations and the work that they're doing in the region and the state on these issues. So with me today, we have Jean-Pierre Brutus, Senior Counsel at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Sara Bronin, Professor of Planning and Law at Cornell University, founder of Desegregate Connecticut, and the founder and director of the National Zoning Atlas, who is joining us virtually, and Peter Kasabak, Executive Director of New Jersey Future. So in that order, I'll just have our panelists say a few more words about their work and the work of the organizations represent. So Jean-Pierre, you want to start us off?
Thank you so much, Matt, for the introduction. And everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. As Matt said, my name is Jean-Pierre Brutus. I am a senior counsel at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We are an advocacy organization located in Newark, New Jersey. We seek to empower people of color with our research and advocacy and build reparative systems. So at the Institute, I work on our economic justice pillar. I lead our reparations task force advocacy, and recently I'm also on our housing advocacy as well. And prior to the Institute, I represented indigent folks in the Bronx who were facing eviction as New York City's Right to Counsel program, and I worked for Legal Services in New York City as part of that program. So at the Institute, in terms of our housing work, we'll get into this a little bit later, but we're pushing for a fair appraisal law, which is currently making its way through legislation. We were also working on some new initiatives, including first generation home buyers assistance, and we're looking at some other programs as well, and we'll get into that in this further discussion. But happy to be here.
Thanks, Jean-Pierre. Sara, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm beaming into you from Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm sorry I can't be with you today. But just by way of brief introduction, I am a lawyer and an architect who also worked in city government as a volunteer, chairing Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission. After finishing that work at the local level, I did start Desegregate Connecticut, which is a coalition of about 80 nonprofit organizations, many unlikely bedfellows, including environmentalists and developers, housing advocates, and preservationists, who all came together to advocate for zoning reforms at the state level last year, this year, and hopefully in the years going forward. I also, as Matt said, founded the National Zoning Atlas, which we'll talk about in a moment. But through that project, and actually through Desegregate Connecticut and my professoring, my main goal is to make sure that people understand how important land use laws are for our daily lives and the huge impacts they have on our economy, on our built environment, on our natural environment, and actually even the very structure of our society. So that's how I come at this project. I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks, Sarah. And Pete.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's fun being back in Princeton, sort of my backyard. I live in Trenton, work in Trenton. I'm going to make a couple other connections. When I started out academically in finance and real estate development. And I started my work at a community development organization in Trenton called ISLES. And I see Sean Jackson, who's the current executive director here. After my time at ISLES, where I ran the housing and planning work in Trenton, I then moved on to the state Housing Mortgage Finance Agency, where I was setting policy and financing all of this affordable housing around the state. And I was actually able to be at the ribbon cutting for the Ethel Lawrence homes that Doug Massey had mentioned earlier. And Michael Floyd and I got to work together at HMFA when we were both there. And for the last 15 years, I've been at New Jersey Housing. All right, see, it's a little habit. For the last 15 years, I've been at New Jersey Future as the executive director. And New Jersey Future is a statewide organization focused on smart growth and sustainable development. And so we're focusing on how do we use our land use better? How do we invest in infrastructure better so that we get the smart growth outcomes and sustainable development outcomes we all want to see, looking at the impacts on the economy, the environment, and social equity.
Great, thanks, Pete, and thanks to our panelists. I want to say this is a really unique opportunity that we have for all those in the room and participating online. We get to hear from experts and practitioners, which is unique, and I think a great opportunity for us to walk out of here with some toolkits to fix a lot of the issues that we will talk about. And just to set the stage, Doug Massey, one of our panelists from the previous session, mentioned his book with Nancy Denton, American Apartheid, which was written and published in 1993. That was my birth year. And so to state that another way, for the entirety of my existence on this planet, we've known just how devastating the consequences of racial, ethnic, and class segregation have been in creating and maintaining just a whole host of intense housing injustices and inequities. And just so it's not lost in anyone, the metro area that we are currently in is one of the worst offenders on all of these measures. So the Trenton-Princeton metro area is the 5th most segregated in the country by race and ethnicity. It is the most segregated by income in the entire country. By my research, it has some of the most exclusionary zoning and land use laws in the entire country. This, as we've learned this morning, by constraining housing choices and concentrating poverty, leads to enormous disparities and inequities across space. That's true within this municipality, where the average home price is now over $1 million. Those sorts of dynamics are going to definitely fuel displacement and exclusion, and a lot of us in the room can speak to that. But it also creates intense disparities across places like Princeton and Trenton. So for instance, we know by census and American Community Survey data that median income in Trenton is around $30,000, whereas it's about $130,000 in Princeton. It's even more disparate when you look at home values and home wealth. So the average home price in Trenton currently is somewhere around $100,000. Again, it's over $1 million in Princeton today. Trenton has one of the worst foreclosure rates in the country still. And our metro area exhibited a pre-COVID-19 eviction filing rate, double the national average. most of that concentrated in Trenton. Thanks to the work of Jean-Pierre and his colleagues at the Institute for Social Justice, we know that New Jersey has one of the most intense and starkest racial wealth gaps in the entire country. So that gap is about 300,000 between white and Black families in the state of New Jersey. And Black homeownership is also extremely unequal in the state of New Jersey. It's somewhere around 38% in New Jersey for Black households, and that same measure is about 75% for white households. So I could go on, but the point is that we've let the situation become dire. And that's the first thing I want to stress. This situation is shaped by policies, some of which are still in existence, which means these are things that we allow to happen. It's not just the Chris Christies of the world, it's us. We're participating in this. And by not advocating for reforming this, we are complicit. But the other thing I want to stress, and it's my charge to you all, is that we can't give way to despair or pessimism. We have to realize that everyone in this room has capacity to turn these things around. And if policies created this situation, then policies can begin to fix it. And so that's going to be the theme of this conversation and our conversation for the rest of the hour. So my opening question to our panelists is exactly that. What policies and practices should we be focusing on to make progress on these issues and to promote housing justice in the near and long term? So I'll have Jean-Pierre start us off, and then we'll go around.
Sure. So my mic is. All right. Sorry about that. So thank you, Matt, for that question. I think obviously that's a big question, and I think the previous panelists touched on a number of issues that I think are important thinking about. How we think about what kind of policies are going to solve this. On the one hand, I think people pointed out that you need a set of policies that are commensurate with the situation, right? This level of scale, the historical nature of this, it requires a certain kind of robust set of policy proposals and measures that are going to address the solution. We can't have this kind of small scale necessarily piecemeal effort to address this situation. At the same time, right, it's not going. There's no silver bullet or panacea that's going to solve this, right? It's going to take a patchwork and a whole set of policies to address this. I do want to step back for a second and think of and set the table in a certain kind of way, conceptually at least. How you think about a problem is also going to determine how you think about the solutions, right? And this morning, some people touched on the idea that the system is dysfunctional, and I want to get away from this idea that we're at this position because the system is dysfunctional. Rather, it's not just functional for a certain group of people. It's specifically designed in this particular kind of way. This is why we see it over and over and over again, right? We can point to things like the New Deal, right? Where Black people were excluded from its benefits in a very particular kind of way. It was intentional, right? We can focus on the GI Bill, go back to slavery, right? And when we think about it that way, and we think about it designed in a very particular kind of way to produce very particular kinds of ends, then it's going to address what kind of solutions we want to address. Because when we think about it being intentional, it's not just a particular administration or set of individuals. We begin to think more sophisticatedly in terms of systems and practices and policies, not think in terms of exceptionality, right? And think, oh, this is just a set of individuals who have done this. Now, in terms of policies, I'll just identify two policies that the Institute is working on and that you can participate in if you support this. First, I'll touch on our fair appraisal bill. It is currently making its way through the legislature. The bill number is S777 in the Senate. It's been heard by multiple committees, and hopefully it's going to be heard by the House Committee soon. All right, and then it will be up for a vote. Now, what this fair appraisal law does, and some of you may be familiar with this because there's been stories in the New York Times, right? You have Black people who are looking to sell their homes, all right? Perfect example is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, for example. He and his wife looking to sell their home. They go on the market, try to sell their home, they get an appraiser to come. The appraiser evaluates their home and appraises it at a much lower level than what they anticipated. The professor then gets his white friend, a white professor at Johns Hopkins, to come in and stand in for him. They remove all the signs of what you quote unquote of their blackness, black family, of their family, artwork, books. And the white appraiser evaluates at a much higher level, right? This happens over and over throughout the country. The Biden administration is focused on this. There was a recent study done over an 8-year period of thousands and thousands of appraisals around the country, demonstrating this level of racial discrimination. 97% of the appraisal industry is white. Right? This appraisal bill would increase the penalties on appraisers who engage in discrimination. It would offer people who face discrimination opportunities to bring complaints to different government divisions and agencies to raise these complaints, as well as to provide an alternative set of appraisals in lieu of what they received from this appraisal, right? And so it's intended to strengthen the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which is a federal law, but this is a state law that would create a new baseline in the state. So it's making its way, and that's S777, the Fair Appraisal Law. The second thing, and thankfully to my panelists this morning, they've already raised this, as I pointed out before. We need a set of policies that are commensurate with what is going on. And first, I want to thank, and what I'm talking about is the Reparations Task Force bill. I want to thank the Princeton Town Council. I want to thank Down in Our Town, and I want to thank the Princeton Civil Rights Commission for helping to pass a resolution in support of this task force. It may not seem like a lot, it might seem symbolic, but for this shows that there's ground level support for this task force bill. And what would that task force bill do? Would study the role of slavery in New Jersey. I'm sure many of you went to public school or private school here in New Jersey and didn't learn about slavery in New Jersey. Maybe you learned about slavery in the South. New Jersey was once known as the slave state of the North. It was the last state to abolish slavery in the North. There was also Jim Crow in New Jersey and redlining. There was, solutions built in the GI Bill here in New Jersey. And so what the commission would do, the task force would do, would study institutional slavery, its aftermath, and then provide recommendations. And it might seem like it's, not related to housing, but very much is, given the scope and the scale of the situation in New Jersey, right? We have this massive homeownership gap in New Jersey. We've got these tremendous differences. We got over 500 something, municipalities in Jersey. There's a very particular reason for that, right? We have to go back to slavery, particularly at a time in slavery when Black people were excluded from owning property, right? So we need to think about it historically. We need to have that kind of historical imagination in order to have this kind of policy imagination, to think about the scale and the scope of what's possible. And so a representative task force will produce the kind of recommendations and policies. We could do that. And then on a smaller scale in the immediate future, we can support something like a fair appraisal bill to end the kind of discrimination at this current moment. Thanks.
Thanks, Jean-Pierre. Sara, what is your set of policies to begin to get us out of this situation?
Yeah, well, my research focuses on the rules of the game. And to me, that's zoning, because without zoning policies that allow housing to be built in the first place, you don't even have a chance to look at these secondary issues like how housing is financed, how housing is appraised, which are critical to the housing that's built now. But my focus is really looking at how can we get more housing to be built by changing the rules of the game. More housing and more diverse kinds of housing in smarter places, I should say. So don't want to throw housing out in the woods. So like Connecticut, New Jersey has some beautiful forested areas, wetlands. These are not places where we should be building. We should be building where we already have infrastructure. But the reality is we don't really know what the rules of the game are. So I know, Matt, your work is focused on the exclusionary policies in and around this area, and of course nationally as well. My work looking at Connecticut, trying to figure out 180 zoning jurisdictions in Connecticut and what those rules say. The truth is we don't have a good way of comparing how towns are doing. And we also don't necessarily have a great way of understanding which specific things in zoning, so which rules of the game have the biggest impact and the worst impacts, because those are the ones we want to change. So minimum lot sizes, something that you've looked at, that those could be pretty problematic because they raise the price of housing. They make you have an acre of land per house, which has environmental consequences too, because that leads to more driving, more pollution, and more consumption of forest and farmland. So we know that one's probably pretty bad, but there are other zoning provisions that we haven't studied enough. Minimum parking requirements, caps on the height, how tall buildings can be. That's something zoning says almost uniformly across Connecticut jurisdictions. I'd bet in New Jersey too. So I guess I would say we can guess at which zoning provisions are pretty bad and constrain the amount of housing that can be built, but we definitely need more research and more researchers that can really get to the heart of the problem and can prove, as all the studies have shown that have been done, have proven on a piecemeal basis, focusing on specific regions or maybe one specific zoning policy, almost all of those have shown that that policy in that region constrains the supply of housing. So it keeps us from building more. But we need something even bigger for us to understand how this works nationally across jurisdictions and increase the number of zoning provisions that we're looking at. So that's, what we're trying to do with the National Zoning Atlas. We have 14 states underway, people really getting in the weeds on these policies, and hoping that at the end of the day, we can enable that kind of research so we can all understand better. And whether it's at the local level, which you can impact now, or at the state level, or even at the federal level, what are the levers of policy that we can use? I would say that zoning is a really big one. Even as we look at all of these other issues for housing that exists now, zoning is about housing for the future.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Pete.
Yeah, so I've been involved in housing policy for a while. I think one of the challenges when we talk about housing policies, we try to wrap it up in one big package and say, we're going to change housing policy and but it came up earlier today, and I think you're hearing it here too, is you've got to figure out what problem you're trying to solve. And there's different policies to get there. And I'll give you some examples. So for example, we'd like to see more housing and more mixed-use development happen in compact, walkable ways. Princeton's a great example of it. More housing downtown, in the center, rental housing, homeownership housing. You want to see more of that. There's a whole set of policies that will drive that type of housing happening in the centers and in the places where we want it, and as Sarah said, and not in the places that we don't want it. But that's not going to produce affordable housing. So that's one set of policies. Now, the other set of policies is if we really are trying to provide affordable housing, we might actually have conflicts between these two approaches. So zoning is a great example. We can increase the zoning density and we can make it so that we get those compact, walkable, dense places. But if we're not careful about how we do that and the way we do that, we're going to end up eliminating affordable housing and in fact creating displacement. So we have to have parallel policies that work together. So in a place like Princeton, I'll use that as an example, you can have the land use policies that encourage the increased zoning, but you've also got to have the affordable housing policies that create more affordable housing, that integrate that affordable housing in the long term. Because if the two aren't working together, we're not going to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And they do have to work together. The other point I wanted to make about zoning is we have to be careful about sort of blanketly increasing density. Because when you do that, when you just create higher density housing, what you're doing is you're creating value. This is one of the amazing things that towns have the ability to do. They can create value. You change zoning, you create value. But what happens is if you just change the zoning and you increase that density, then what you're doing is you're transferring that value to the landowner. And that doesn't help us. What we need to do is we need to be able to tie the strings to that increase in zoning so that we're making affordable housing a part of that increased density. We're making stormwater management, we're making biking and walking amenities part of that, so that we as the public are capturing that value by making those changes. So those are the kind of policies that we're looking at New Jersey Future, is how to not only look at getting the density and the compact, walkable, and infrastructure in place, but also how to embed the affordable housing as we're doing that and as we go. Last point I'll make, and I'm sorry about this, but too much talking maybe, is that You also have to look at how the market works. And so different communities, Matt did a great job of explaining, Mercer County is a really diverse county. You were to look at it as a county. But when you get down to the neighborhood level, it's extremely segregated. And that's not just racially and economic, it's also about real estate markets. And so when you look at zoning, you look at subsidizing housing, you have to look at that level, at that neighborhood census tract level for the kind of policy changes or investments that you're going to make that are unique to those places. Because blanket policies don't work. And in fact, they can do the opposite.
Thank you, Pete. And thanks to all three panelists. This gives us a lot to dig into. And we'll just go back and forth as panelists want to jump in. But I'll start with a little bit of what Pete was just talking about, because it's something I think we encounter in Princeton all the time. We might agree that housing is really getting unaffordable, and it's been that way for a long time, but we seem to disagree on the ways to get to solutions and moderate or even bring down the price of housing. And this is something we see a lot. There's disagreement on what can be accomplished through zoning reform. And oftentimes, I think we miss the real barriers to getting zoning reform through local municipal authorities as well. And keeping in mind that these are folks in the room who can advocate for the right ways of turning this around, I'll pose the question: how do we grapple with the difficulty, what zoning reform can and can't accomplish, and doing sort of what Pete was suggesting, like how do we both reform zoning laws that we know are excluding and inflating housing prices, but doing it in a way that's equitable and is going to promote affordable housing and promote integrated neighborhoods and communities.
Yes. I can do this.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? There's a couple of ways. One is you really have to the town has to take affordable housing seriously. And again, I'll divide towns up a little bit into high opportunity towns and not high opportunity towns. And I will put my hometown in the not high opportunity town, Trenton. But if you're in a high opportunity town, the goal really has to be how to get more affordable housing integrated into your housing stock for the long term. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. There you can do inclusionary ordinances, which means if you're going to be building housing, then you have to have a percentage of that be affordable housing. You can buy down existing housing. You can have an apartment building that has 10 units of housing. You can buy down 2 of those units to make them affordable without actually increasing the stock of housing, but changing the mix of housing. You can also look at conversions. So if you have a single family community, you could have a single family house in that community that gets converted into a 2-family house that's affordable to 2 families. Won't change the look of the neighborhood at all, but it changes who can live there, and it changes the how we do things. So having very intentional affordable housing policies and putting them in place and putting resources behind them is one way of doing that.
Great. I'll throw in, when I mean barriers too, I mean building the political will to get this stuff done. I think, Sara, your experience at Desegregate Connecticut, I believe you'd have a little bit to say on that piece in particular, if you may.
Yeah, I mean, Peter said many of the sort of general strategies that have worked for towns. I mean, there's also the possibility of working at the state levels to set ground rules for towns. Now in New Jersey, you guys have this whole Mount Laurel state agency and requirements for every town, this fair share model. That actually, has produced some housing, so I want to acknowledge that. But that is, one way of thinking about solving the housing affordability problem. But in some ways, it's a bit outdated, because you may or may not want to put housing everywhere for environmental reasons. And so thinking about that walkability, those transit nodes, existing infrastructure, trying to marry affordability concerns and really locations where people will want to and be able to walk and get easily to services that they need. That's, I think, maybe an emerging approach, and one that I think the housing advocacy community is hopefully becoming more climate curious, climate interested, and seeing that as another option. So you have over in New Jersey a sort of state overlay over a lot of local zoning decisions in a very unique way. Other states have done things differently. So California has set ground rules for accessory dwelling units statewide. And what that has done is it's allowed homeowners all around the state to produce a second unit of housing on their lot where they have a single family home, which in a way doubles the density of that housing, but also enables the homeowner to get some extra income and brings a housing unit that's smaller than might have otherwise been built in a single family neighborhood into those neighborhoods, and just adds some diversity to the options. So that's a statewide example of approach where you lay the ground rules. Connecticut has started to do something similar in addition to an ADU law. It passed a minimum parking law statewide that said that you can't have more than a certain number of parking spaces for 0 and 1 bedroom or 2 or more bedroom apartments. Allows towns to opt out. So far, only one has that I know of. And that town had the requirement specifically for apartments and for studio apartments that developers or property owners had to build 3 parking spaces for every studio apartment in the zoning rules. Okay, so think about that, right? Okay, so you have to laugh. I mean, the boldness of this, and there through our survey, our Connecticut zoning atlas, we found that there were many towns that did that. Not every town, but 3 parking spaces. You don't live in a studio apartment and normally have 3 cars. So what is the reason for that kind of requirement at the local level? The reason is probably to deter that kind of housing. So the state level involvement is I would say a trend that's emerging in lots of different states. Again, New Jersey has a particular approach in that regard. Other states are looking more, I guess you could say, at ground rules guidance for local governments who don't, as Peter said, have that thought in their mind that they are going to take affordable housing seriously. So at least they have some ground rules with these new statewide rules.
Thanks, Sarah. I also want to slightly turn the conversation to another part of this puzzle, and that is the very important part of redeveloping and revitalizing communities that have borne decades and decades of racist housing policy and disinvestment. It's certainly connected to the fight to end exclusionary zoning in privileged places like our municipality, but this is another side of the bigger picture of how we again fight these massive inequalities across space. And I think our panelists can speak to some contemporary redevelopment and promising practices in this area, but also maybe some, I know the Institute has put out some work on perhaps more innovative or less experimented efforts, such as land banks or shared equity housing like community land trusts. So in no particular order, I'd like us to sort of help us imagine how we can develop more equitably, particularly in places that have been really ground zero for the worst and the most discriminatory housing policies of the past.
Sure, so I'll touch on this briefly. I think one of the things that the Institute has been looking into, and we've seen this in Newark in particular, and hopefully we'll see this in other parts of the state, we begin to see what's called the community land trust and community land banks, where it's an alternative to the kind of market housing or traditional housing that we've seen, where it's basically an opportunity for mostly low-income people, but moderately income people to purchase a home in which they can start to build their credit equity, and so that yes, it's not going to produce the kind of equity that they would if they were to purchase a home, not as part of community land trust, but you enter into an agreement in which you agree to basically not sell the home for over a certain amount or over a certain amount of time. And that allows prices to stay affordable so that others can come in and purchase a home. But what it really basically does is it's almost like an entry into the home ownership and housing market. So what it does is it allows you to enter with others who are similarly minded. And it's a way to protect also the trust as well. It's a new model. It's very experimental. It's really in New Jersey, only in Newark. And one of the former assemblywomen, or she's a current assemblywoman, is a supporter of this. She was ahead of the trust. It's the reason why I think it's we called for a statewide land bank to make it easier for municipalities in New Jersey to follow this kind of model, given the fact that it's only in Newark, and we'd like to see it spread throughout New Jersey. We've seen it in other states, but it's really a Newark-based thing, and it's not as prevalent as we would like it to be. And also, I think, maybe we'll touch upon this, and I think we've seen in terms of sort of the negative aspects, not of land trust, but we've seen an increase of corporations buying up housing in Newark and in the state of New Jersey. And I just want to raise that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but there's been a recent report by the state of New Jersey about places like in Trenton as well. We've seen this massive increase, as well as the climate reports. David Trout, professor at Rutgers, who leads an institute on this very issue.
Jump here. Pete or Sarah, thoughts on the redevelopment piece?
I have lots of thoughts. I'll let Sarah go.
I was going to pass it over to you because I'd love to hear the follow-up from.
All right, I'll take it. I think the first thing is to break out two different issues that we're talking about. One is around affordable housing, and it's to make sure that housing stays affordable as shelter. And we have a very mixed housing policy in New Jersey and in the country, where we think housing can do everything. It can build wealth and it can provide affordable housing. And those two are at conflicts. And so what we're having in New Jersey right now is we will never be able to build our way out of our affordable housing. Everyone knows supply and demand. We'll never be able to build enough housing to have prices fall to where lower and moderate income people will be able to afford it. So that's not going to work. So we have to take housing out of the market. We've got to decommodify a certain amount of housing so that it's no longer part of the market system of appreciating and wealth building. It's housing, it's shelter for people. And you have to integrate that into the rest of our housing stock. And the land trust is a perfect example of that. You can do it through land trusts, you can do it through public housing, you can do it through long-term deed restrictions, but you've got to pull the housing out of the market if we're going to have it be affordable, especially for lower and moderate income people. So that was me. So that's a really important dynamic to talk about. The other one that Matt is referring to, I think in particular, is in a place like Trenton, we have a lot of affordable housing. That's not necessarily the biggest issue in Trenton. The issue there is we don't have mixed income housing because we don't have people of middle incomes and upper incomes who are living there to have mixed income housing. And so how does a place like Trenton, where do the investments come from to start to create the mixed income communities that we want to see? And that takes public dollars. And you heard earlier today, it's about trying to improve the public spaces and the public goods and the public infrastructure to a level that attracts people. The flip side of that is as we do that, we've got to be careful that we're not displacing. And that's a fine line to walk, but it's one that can be walked.
Great. I want to pick up on a thread that Pete mentioned before we open it up to questions from the audience, and it's this idea of sort of, to put it another way, reimagining how we do housing in this country. I'm thinking of work from scholars like Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who remind us that housing in this country has always been racialized, and it's always been drivers of intense racial disparities. and social inequality. And not just in the racist policies of the past, but even when we try to tinker with policies and improve them, exclusion and, to use the term she has coined, predatory inclusion, seep their way into our policies. So you can see this, we sort of oscillate between things like redlining and then the Section 235 and 236 programs, or even more recently, the foreclosure crisis. And you could add what Jean-Pierre was just mentioning, this drive of institutional investors purposefully taking advantage of our lack of affordable housing and exacerbating an already bad situation. So the point I'm getting at is to frame this moving forward. How do we get to a housing system where it's not predatory or zero sum? It is moving to this idea that housing is not a commodity but a human right, and something that that we can all embrace. So I'm curious. I'm asking us to dream big, but how do we get to a vision of that and move forward with it? What might that look like?
I guess I'll go first. The big question. I think you raised Kang's book, This Profit. Part of that of her intervention is the idea that the market is also racialized. That the market is not this kind of race neutral space that's going to solve issues around housing, right? And that's kind of, and it's kind of a little bit of a corrective to the work of Richard Rothstein in The Color of Law, that it's federal programs or federally directed programs that were specifically designed to produce these kind of ends without leaving the market to one side. Some of the points made by Matt and Pete about decommodifying housing. We have seen, though, that as Black people and other people of color entered into public housing, the way in which we've seen a significant disinvestment in public housing, right, over the past 40, 50 years, and the way in which housing and public housing has become associated with substandard housing and associated with people of color, as opposed to in other countries where you've seen this kind of dynamism around public housing. And so much to the point where public housing is not really part of the conversation around solutions to the housing problem. And so when you're thinking about reimagining or imagining new kinds of ways or thinking about housing differently, it's extremely difficult, as pointed out, because housing is so intimately tied to people producing equity and wealth, and then to their notions of how they live and who they are. And so detaching that, I'm not sure how that's, how we're going to go ahead and do that, right? That's going to take a lot of work, a lot of political will. One of the things I think we do think is alternative models to producing wealth in this country, maybe not attaching it to homeownership, right? We need to think about that. And we need to think about housing in a different kind of way when we think about housing as a right. And I think, I don't have all the answers, and it would be, so I just have, ideas about what, possibilities of what we could see in the future. But I do think it is instructive of, it is, a major part of what we need to do. I have to go back to this. I can't stress this enough. We do need to have a reparations task force to think about the role of how race shapes all of this. Because, when we think about abstractions around exclusionary zoning, right, and building, 3 parking lots for a particular, size apartment that doesn't need 3, those things, that level of abstraction is to address the kind of race neutral, colorblind post-civil rights era, and the kind of legal architecture that we need at this moment is to pierce that kind of colorblind legal kind of abstractions around, race neutral language around exclusion. We need, the law has to catch up in a certain kind of sense, or our framing of how the law. And so I think, as part of our reimagining, we need to think less of a kind of anti-discrimination kind of framework and more about how we're going to address the market's role in producing these kinds of inequalities as well.
Thanks, Jean-Pierre. Sara, Pete, your paths to housing justice?
Sure. So I think, as Jean-Pierre just said, it's about, the housing market is defined by laws. And so I think, zoning is not the only law that affects how our markets are the supply and the affordability of housing. It's laws on lending, on finance, on whether we are producing public housing or publicly subsidized housing, the rules of those programs. Getting down into those details across all of the different facets that we've discussed today is critically important. And I think, we're not teaching that enough in law schools. We're not focusing on that enough. I know, even at my own at school, we don't do that enough, and we don't train the lawyers of tomorrow to really get into the nitty gritty here. And so I think that there's a gap in terms of how we can change the frameworks, the legal frameworks that dictate these outcomes, and the army of lawyers and policy folks that need to take what we know we need to do, or what we learned that we need to do through the process to actually change it. So I think, all of I agree with everything that has been said. And I think we, just from an academic angle, I see that there is a big gap between the kinds of things that we're training people to do and training them to think about, and a big gap in the information that people have to actually get from A to Z.
I think that last point is really important too, about the gap in knowledge and understanding. And I think one of the first things is to help people understand and sort of bust the myth that the market is going to solve this. That, if we just tweak the market, we would have this would be all solved. So yes, we're going to have to look at the mechanisms that drive the market, but there are some things that the market is not going to do. It's not going to provide affordable housing in New Jersey. And so recognizing what the market can and can't do, and then getting over that and figuring out how to then have an honest conversation about how we solve it is one. The other, and we didn't really talk about this, but it's in New Jersey, we've got 564 municipalities. Every municipality has control over its own fiefdom. And we don't think of ourselves as anything other than being in our community, in our township, in our political structure. And we need to think of ourselves in a regional context. I mean, it's very easy to say Trenton is over there and Princeton is here, but we're all in Mercer County, if you want to use the county as a catchment area. The size of Mercer County, if we were a city instead of a county, you'd be the size of Tampa, you'd be the size of New Orleans, Cleveland. We're not big. Mercer County is not a big place. If we were able to start thinking of ourselves as a region and start to make decisions regionally, a lot of these other things would start to break down. And I'll go back to what was mentioned earlier about the schools. The way we fund the schools is ridiculous. One of the most simple things we could do is regionalize the way we fund our schools and administer them.
That's great. And ends us on a very practical solution moving forward, which we'll turn over to questions from the audience now. And I'll just remind everyone, we do have experts and practitioners up here. So even specific questions, the more specific, the better, because there's a lot of places to start on this. So
I'm actually going to start with a question from the online audience. Anna Gable asks, I'm wondering if anyone is doing research on how to plan for safe and affordable housing for undocumented residents. Usually access to off-market affordable housing is dependent upon legal status. Are there models for keeping landlords accountable to tenants who can't access subsidized housing, especially in a community like Princeton?
I'm not familiar with it. I don't know what you want.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with anything like that.
I could just note that, I mean, there isn't much research on it. And I think that speaks to another barrier to affordable housing is that, citizenship status is going to be yet another barrier to the ones we already know exist. But just because there's no research on it yet doesn't mean that there's not a need for it and that we shouldn't have a sense of urgency about it. So the question is definitely well taken.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Connie Escher. I'm author of She Calls Herself Betsy Stockton. And I'm not a housing expert, but I am an expert in the history of Princeton. And one of the reasons why Princeton is such a desirable and wonderful place today is because of her 4 schools and churches in the housing community. There was home ownership as early as 1820, 1830 in Princeton. And it was people like Betsy Stockton who had agency coming from the community that stabilized it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick question regarding community land trusts. How are or can they be financed?
Want to start? Okay. It's, I think, first of all, that's still being figured out because these are fairly rare. That doesn't mean they have to be. Typically, the upfront financing is the hardest part because these are parcels of land that are owned by nonprofit groups, and depending on where you're purchasing the land, those land prices can be really, really tremendous. Princeton being a good example, and then also the housing costs. So typically how this is done is through land donations, and there are examples in California. I want to say San Francisco is one example of essentially nonprofit groups doing crowdsource funding and literally buying a building from a landlord. But that goes to show that that's not a scalable solution. We need our housing finance apparatus to start realizing that this is a viable way to not only house people, but do it in perpetuity. I mean, the benefit, one of the many benefits of community land trust is that it's social housing that remains permanently affordable, as opposed to a lot of the ways we finance affordable housing in this country. And there's an initiative to bring one to Princeton. So if you want to talk about that, I'd be happy to do that afterwards. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. 2 points. First, thank you very much, Pete, for bringing up thinking regionally, and that people in this room should know something already about the Latino Action Network versus New Jersey, the case that's now live in the hands of a judge to address segregation in our schools. New Jersey is now more segregated than it was 50 years ago. And then second, if we focus on housing as shelter, not wealth building, what about policies about allowing people to build credit through renting?
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and it came up earlier too, that we have fallen back on housing and home ownership as a wealth building strategy, but it's not the only one, and it doesn't have to be the only one. Just like it's not the only way to build credit. So I think those are excellent ideas. We need to explore those alternative ways of not only building credit, but of building wealth.
Hi, I'm Sean Jackson with Isles down in Trenton, and we're working with Pete and others in the city and trying to develop housing there and the like. And the biggest challenge we face is resources. So with this august group of experts up here, a great contrast to be able to say, if anyone's got exposure or knowledge around how we subsidize the home ownership structure that does exist today for single family home, for example, what are the different ways that government policy and funding subsidizes those, that we could contrast that to how underfunded the resources are for affordable housing development in places like Trenton?
And like how we invest in highway expansions instead of doing that, we could be building road.
Well, it's that, it's the the deductions people can take, the millionaire house that can get it, deduct all that interest, quantify all those kinds of dollars.
It's a great point. I always love there's Reverend Eric Dobson at the Fair Share Housing Center, and I love how he puts it.
Maybe do you want to? Another mic.
No,
Is that better?
That's good. Thank you.
Sorry. To that point, this is not my quote. This is Reverend Eric Dobson of the Fair Share Housing Center. But he always says, if you have a mortgage, you live in subsidized housing.
Right.
And we never think about it that way. But our federal government does far more to subsidize homeownership than it does anything about rental stability, building affordable housing. But again, this is it doesn't have to be this way. And all of these conversations are about building the political will to reverse that. And we haven't gotten there yet, and it hasn't reached mass consciousness, but that's a way of reframing. Our policies are doing exactly the reverse of what we need, but we can change it.
Hi, Yana Moore.
Hello, my name is Yana Moore. I'm associated with a couple of organizations, certainly as I'm longstanding 45-year-old housing organization, Princeton Jackson Development Corporation, that when founded, purchased 23 houses in the neighborhood and resold them to Princeton Jackson residents as a form of certainly wealth building, which was not, it wasn't then, but certainly household stabilization and housing as a necessity. I'm also involved with the Concerned Black Alumni of Princeton, who's seeking really through a lot of different areas, not just housing, specific policies and actions on the part of Princeton University to address the impacts that it has had on this community. Full disclosure, we recently have been funded by them through a settlement to a lawsuit due to their non-payment of taxes, which continues and grows. But we also are woefully deficient in being able to stem the tide of displacement. We have some in the community who believe being progressive means to find housing for middle income, but displace the affordable housing in the Witherspoon Jackson neighborhood with those higher earning individuals. That is aggressive. It's certainly not progressive. So we really have to be very careful. I think when you mentioned, Peter, about regionalized, something we haven't done, that was the foundation of the COA program. But Princeton became the most desirable affordable housing location that everybody wanted to come to. We could not serve our own by preference to live in the community affordably. Instead, they were competing with the region. Your idea is interesting about regionalizing the funding of education, because of course, that's one of the major attractors. So getting to something that I think was one of Matt's solutions or suggestions, at least from the article that I read in the Daily Princetonian, as a result of his research, is that there should be greater reliance on those who are creating the demand for housing, not just the developers who obviously have a financial interest, but those who are creating the demand, and those are the employers and the institutions around us. Princeton used to hire more people, employ more people within the community. They sort of slacked back on that, but now, of course, due to sustainability, people are seeing that it's a desire, but it should not only be to the upper echelon of faculty, it should be in all categories, because that is pushing our historic neighbors out of town, all of us, of any earning capacity, okay, because they preference or roles. So I'm looking for really some real policies that are going to drive both those who are creating demand and making them responsible, as they did in Massachusetts when I was there during the creation of the Mount Laurel, to ensure that the people with the money and those that are greatest beneficiaries of our living here are paying the price.
Thank you.
I would just give three quick answers. One is employer-assisted housing is a very good model, and we don't use it anywhere near enough as we should. The idea of having some local preference for affordable units, I agree with, and I think the state has gone a little too far to one side on that. And then the third is really being more aggressive about creating that housing in the John Street Witherspoon area as for permanent affordability. And the trade-off is that, and you gave a great example, you sold a house to a low-income family, right, as to be a homeowner. And that's great, it's affordable to them. But now there's a choice to be made. Either that house is going to appreciate and that person is going to be able to sell it and make money and build wealth, or they're going to sell it to another family who is lower income, and then they won't be able to build wealth, but they'll have a house in a desirable community. And I would pick the latter. Yeah,
And
yeah, or share, right? Share.
so there's clearly still plenty of interest in this, and we thankfully have time to have these conversations, because for the next hour, we'll be transitioning into our community action fair. So keep the energy that you have about this, because we can now engage with local actors who are working on these issues. And I'm sure panelists will still be available for questions, but I do just want to leave everyone with the reminder that, again, it is in our capacity to work on these issues and to begin to solve them. And I don't want that to be lost on anyone, because if it's not going to be us, who is going to step up? And so with that, I just want to thank everybody for being here. I hope to see you around at the Action Fair, and I look forward to working with you all in this endeavor going forward. So again, great to see you all. Happy holidays, and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.